there's this feeling amongst doctors that diabetes is sort of chronic and progressive, but at the same time we were saying that, we knew it wasn't true. It was complete fabrication, because if you lose weight, we also knew it was almost for sure that your diabetes would either disappear or get much better. So it was a reversible disease. We knew it. Like, we knew that even as we were saying it was chronic and progressive. So it was, one was obviously a lie. And it was basically a lie we told ourselves because we were doing so badly on getting people to lose weight. So we lied to ourselves to say that this is chronic and progressive, when really, if we were being truthful, we should have said that doctors are doing such a crappy job in getting people to lose weight that they're getting the diabetes and therefore getting the kidney disease. And that's very close to the truth. So that's where I became extremely interested in the question of weight loss and why we're doing such a poor job. And a lot of it, I think, stems from this sort of obsession with calories,
Mhm.
which is, you know, it sort of misses the mark because the body doesn't actually measure calories in any way. So if it doesn't measure it, it doesn't, detect it, it doesn't respond to it, then that's not the most important thing we should be focusing on. And that was sort of the focus of my first book, The Complete Guide, the Obesity Code, which is a science based book on sort of what causes weight gain and weight loss. And one of the natural, in the last chapter, I talk about intermittent fasting because that's actually a strategy that makes a lot of sense from a physiologic standpoint, because I sort of went back to the beginnings and said, this is what causes obesity. It's really a hormonal disease, and this is what we can do about it. And sort of the last chapter was about fasting. And then that's where I started to use it in a lot of my patients and saw a huge amount of success. Like, stuff that honestly just blew my mind. Like, people that I had been treating for sort of 15 years with type 2 diabetes. And, we started fasting and we changed their diet and it just went away. Like, I had a guy who I had followed forever, and, nice guy, always wanted to do whatever he could to get better, but I didn't have the right advice to give him. And then finally, when I changed that advice, we got him off, I think he was on like 120 units of insulin, which is a really massive dose, to like zero. Like, we took him off everything. His sugars were normal. So we actually made him non-diabetic, and he's been non-diabetic for about 6 years now. After 30 years of type 2 diabetes, including 15 under my own care, right? Or 10 under my own care. So kind of ridiculous. And that's where I became very interested in sort of promoting these ideas so that people won't have to get, bad medical advice, such as the same one I was giving for so many years, and be able to make themselves better. Because again, if you get rid of that type 2 diabetes, then you are not only at lower risk of kidney disease, but you're at lower risk of a huge amount of other problems like heart disease and strokes and amputations and blindness and cancer. So, like, really, really important stuff that nobody was talking about. I mean, when I started talking about fasting in sort of 2013, 2014, like, people thought it was insane to skip a single meal. It's like, and I'm like, why? Why would why can't you miss a meal? And everybody had the consensus. Like, honestly, like 99.9% of medical professionals were like, no, you can't miss a single meal. And I'm like, why? Because if you look at the physiology, the body will just use some of the sugar and the fat, because that is literally the very reason we store body fat and blood sugars, like, so that we have a source of energy when we don't eat. We figured it out a long time ago when we were cavemen. If we didn't weren't able to survive a few missed meals, we wouldn't be sitting here today, because we as a species would all be dead, because food is intermittently available. So therefore we have evolved those things. And that's what body fat is. So if you have too much of it, let your body use it up. That's all you're doing. You're using the body fat for literally the reason that we have it. It all comes down to food. I think that's really true. And I get the same things when I talk about how important food is. You get these looks from other doctors. It's like, oh, this guy's crazy. And I think that to some extent, what it reflects is the changing sort of paradigms of medicine
Mhm.
that we're seeing. Because if you go into the 20th century, then the major diseases you're talking about, so from 1900 to about 1980, 1990, you're talking about infections, so pneumonias and diarrhea and TB and all these diseases of, that are infectious. I mean, even now, of course, COVID, but we developed all these great antibiotics. So penicillin and all this, and we developed HIV drugs and all this sort of stuff. And we got that really well done. But the paradigm of medicine became sort of, you come to me as a doctor or as a nurse practitioner, I give you a drug, and hey, you get better, right? You have pneumonia, I give you some kind of penicillin or something like that, you get better. And the problem is that the diseases change. So we got better at that. We got wound up with a lot of chronic diseases because we weren't dying of these, infections. So what happens is, of course, you have chronic diseases like heart disease, like diabetes, like obesity, sort of these metabolic diseases, which lead to other things. But we use the same paradigm of medicine. That is, you come to me, I give you a drug. So if you're diabetic, you come to me, I give you insulin. And the problem is that that was never the right paradigm, because the paradigm in these chronic diseases is that you have to prevent these diseases and you have to go back to the root cause, which gets us back to insulin. If you have too much insulin, you're going to gain too much weight. And that's the problem. So giving a drug is not going to help it, because you got to get to the root of the problem, which winds up being a lot of food. So it's this paradigm shift that we've seen over the last sort of 20 years that a lot of doctors are missing, because they're still in that mindset of, you have diabetes, you come to me, I give you a drug. You have heart disease, I give you a stent. You have, cancer, I give you chemotherapy, rather than going back and saying, well, what is it that led to this heart disease? Well, it's from the diabetes, which put him at risk, which was due to the obesity, which put him, gave him the type 2 diabetes. So let's get him to change his foods, lose weight, and therefore not get heart disease. Like, that's the paradigm we have to be in now. And there's a huge amount of resistance because there's no money in it, right? So all the drug companies and all that sort of still want to stay in this old paradigm of medicine. And so it comes down to sort of insulin, because that comes down to the weight, which is leading to a lot of these problems. And the thing about insulin is that it's a normal hormone. Okay, so it's just does a job. Okay, and the problem is that it's too much. Like, if you have too much or too little of any hormone, you're going to run into problems. If you have too much thyroid hormone, you have hyperthyroidism. You treat it, right? If you have too little thyroid hormone, you give it. So insulin has a job to do. It's a normal hormone. It's not there's nothing bad about insulin intrinsically, but any hormone is good in the right amount, and too much, too little is bad. So insulin, its job is to tell you to store calories, right? So calories are just a unit of food energy. You eat, you have calories. Well, the insulin is what tells you that it needs to be stored. Okay, and we've known this for 50 years. When you eat, insulin goes up, and insulin does a number of things. It increases sort of glycogen production. So you take glucose, you string it into long strings called glycogen, you store it in your liver. So it's a way to store glucose or sugar. If you have enough glycogen, then what your body's going to do is you're going to take this glucose and you're going to turn it into fat, and that's called de novo lipogenesis. If you dietary fat, it actually goes directly into your fat stores, but what insulin does is it blocks you from burning that fat, right? Because your body, when you have insulin, you want to store calories. That's a good thing, because when you eat, you need to store some of it away for, that's the reason you don't die in your sleep every single night. It's because you're able to store some of that food energy away. And when you don't eat, such as when you're sleeping, then your insulin is going to fall and you're going to start to pull some of that food energy back out. So either the sugar or the body fat. So even though insulin by itself doesn't necessarily cause body fat, it sort of indirectly does, because it blocks you from burning fat, because you're trying to store energy, not use it. So that's its job. It's doing what it's supposed to do, but different foods stimulate insulin to a different degree. So when we changed our diet in 1977, where we said eat lots of carbs, right? So the food pyramid, the original food pyramid, which was full of bread on the base, right? 7 to 11 servings of bread and rice and potatoes, that's what you should be eating. Well, what happened is that we started eating a diet that was very high, that was very stimulating to glucose. We know that. So you eat bread, your blood glucose goes up. You can measure it in the glycemic index. So blood glucose goes up, blood insulin goes up. When blood insulin goes up, all of your energy is being shuttled into storage. And that's the big problem. If you're shuttling all of your energy into storage, so say you eat white bread and jam in the morning, and you store it all away, and there's no energy coming back out because your insulin's high, you're blocking the use of any of your stored energy. You're pushing it all into storage. Well, there's nothing left. So then you get hungry at like 10:30. You had your bread and, your white bread and jam in the morning. By 10:30, you're looking around for a low-fat muffin because there's no energy left. You put it all into storage, right? And the same thing happens. Insulin spikes way up. You take all those energy, the calories that you had from your low-fat muffin, you store it all into storage, and then you're hungry. Lunchtime comes around, you eat a big plate of pasta, store it all away. And the problem is now you're eating all the time. You're eating 5-6 times a day. And that's sort of people that said, well, we're eating low fat and therefore eating 6 times a day. So therefore eating 6 times a day must be good, right? The premise, which is eating a low, very high carb diet was good. That was the incorrect premise, but led to us eating 6-7 times a day and then telling our kids and everybody who would listen that you should eat small meals constantly throughout the day. It's not the number of calories that you eat, it's what your body does with those calories. So you have to understand that, everybody says it's just the amount of calories. It's not the amount, because when you put in food energy into your mouth, your body has 2 options. You can burn it or you can store it, right? So if you burn it, it's fine. You're not going to gain body fat. If you store it, you will gain body fat. So the problem is not the number of calories. The problem is what you do with those calories. So that depends on the hormone, particularly insulin. And that means that the foods you put in your mouth, which stimulate insulin to a different degree, the only thing it means is that certain foods are more fattening than other foods. If the bottom line is that some foods are fattening, some are not, which is not any different than what your grandmother would have said, right? She would have said, you're not going to get fat eating broccoli, right? So logical conclusion, then you say, well, then I should eat less of these high insulin foods and more of these not high insulin foods. I'm going to fill up on the vegetables and the meat and the eggs and not fill up on cookies and that kind of thing, right? And that's the only thing that we're trying to say. And everybody says, well, you're so anti-science with calories. I'm like, no, the calories is simply a very low level of thinking. It's a very simplistic level of thinking. What you have to think is the level above it. That is, what is the body doing with those calories? What's the hormonal response? What's your body doing? And of course, what determines how many calories you eat anyway? Well, it's your hunger, which is all dependent on hormones. And what determines how many calories, like people talking about fat equals calories in minus calories out? Well, that's always true, but it's almost always misunderstood, because what determines calories out is not just, your willpower. It's how hungry you are. If you're hungry, you eat more. If you're less hungry, you eat less. That's the bottom line. And what determines how many calories you expend, right? It's not exercise. It's almost all basal metabolic rate. And what controls your basal metabolic rate? Well, it's your hormones. So what you're doing is you're trying to get to a deeper level understanding of what causes body weight gain. So therefore, you can make a sort of rational decision. If insulin's too high, how am I going to lower insulin? So changing your diet is a perfectly rational way to do that. But there's another way to do that, and that's intermittent fasting. It's very simple. It's been used for thousands of years. If you don't eat, your insulin is going to drop. As your insulin drops, your body's going to start pulling those calories out from storage and start using it. And the key is that there's nothing intrinsically unhealthy about it. Actually, it turns out to be super healthy for most people in North America. Yeah, and I think that was the same. So I did a lot of training in the 90s as well. And of course, that was sort of the heyday of the low-fat diet. And if you remember being cardiology, we had those step 1, step 2 diets. If you remember, they were terrible. Like, so these, in case the readers, the listeners don't know what they are, is this was an idea back in the 90s where if you had a heart attack, you should lower your dietary fat to less than 10%, which is really impalatable. But it was based on the idea that fat caused heart disease, right? So the problem was that fat didn't really cause heart disease. And so you're just eating this terrible diet that wound up being full of carbohydrates, and most of those carbohydrates were refined and a lot of sugar, because people didn't care about sugar back in the 90s. They only cared about fat. That was the only thing anybody cared about. And then if you had another heart attack on this low fat diet, the step 1 diet, you'd go to a step 2 diet, which was 7% total fat, which was just horrible stuff. And then all these studies came out that said, well, first of all, these low fat diets actually didn't work at all. So there's the Lyon study, and there's a number of other studies that led to this whole, remember the French paradox, where they said, hey, these French people are eating way more fat. They're eating this full fat dairy, crazy people, and they're eating like meat and like foie gras and stuff. Like, they're crazy. They're going to get heart attacks. But of course, they had a third of the heart disease that Americans did, right? Because the fat wasn't that bad for you. So this led to this whole discussion about the French paradox. And that was where people said, well, we know that fat is bad and they're eating a lot of fat, so therefore they must be doing something else right, which is the red wine. And it's like, okay, well, that might have been true or not, but it was probably that the fat just wasn't that bad for you. And then in the 2000s, they came out with all these studies that started to show that, hey, there's a ton of fat sources, dietary fat sources, that were really, really good for you, like omega-3s and fatty fish and nuts and olive oil, Mediterranean diet and avocados and all this stuff, right? It was just, a total repudiation of what we did in the 90s. So then, of course, everybody started eating more fat. And then now, the people talk about saturated fat, and there's a lot of evidence that even the butter. So the tragic thing about the butter, of course, was that people said saturated fat like butter was bad for you, right? So you should eat margarine. So you'll remember all this stuff. So, oh my God. So margarine was vegetable oils, but is worse than that. They actually changed it so that they processed it even further into trans fats, which we now know are really, really bad for you. So it's estimated that these trans fats caused about 100,000 plus heart attacks and deaths in the United States every year. So that was due to the trans fats. So we told people, in other words, as doctors and dietitians and nurses, we told people to eat the butter, to switch from the butter to the margarine, because it'll be healthier for your heart, and you'll remember Bissell and all that stuff. And in fact, what we told them to eat, the margarine, was actually causing the heart attacks. Like, that is so tragic. I can't believe that nobody even talks about it anymore. So of course, butter sales plummeted and margarine sales went up, and then everybody got their heart attacks. And then, 20 years later, in 2015 or so, 2012, people are like, hey, those trans fats were all killing us. And now it's totally reversed, and butter's going back up and margarine's going back down. It's like, well, why did we think that we were so much smarter than Mother Nature? Butter, which is a natural food that we've been eating for thousands of years. Like, why did we think that butter, we've been eating it for 1,000 years, and since 1970, it's going to kill us, right? It's like, how does that work? As opposed to margarine, which we had never eaten, it's much more likely to kill us because our bodies just haven't had a chance to adapt to it. So it was a sort of a whole tragic story about this dietary fat thing. Caused a lot of disease, a lot of heart attacks, people getting sick and obese and type 2 diabetic. And yet still nobody says, like, it was all our fault, right? Like, as a medical scientific community, we should never have really gone that far off into the deep end without demanding the evidence that it was actually true, which nobody ever did. And that, I think, is the big problem. Like, all the naysayers who said, fat's not that bad for you. They're like, oh, these guys are quacks, right? They're going to kill people, like, with their olive oil and their avocados and nuts. Like, they're going to kill people, right? That's what you said. That's what we said in the 90s. It was really, sort of a tragic time. When a plateau happens, we always say you have to sort of shake things up a little bit. So the problem when you plateau is that what you're doing and what your body is doing has now reached in equilibrium. So your body always reacts to what you're doing. That is the normal process of homeostasis. That is, if you adjust something, your body adjusts differently. So just like if you go into a concert, and it's really, really loud, right? But you get used to it after a little bit, or you go into a dark room, you get used to it, and then you go into the sunlight, it's like, whoa, it's so bright. So your body is always adjusting, and that happens for everything. So it happens if you change your diet too, right? You can change into a really good diet, you can still plateau. I mean, we all know that, right? You eat what you think is a great diet, and it's doing great, and then you plateau. So same thing with the fasting, it can happen as well. So in that case, there's sort of several ways that you can go. You can either just continue and hope that things will get better. And sometimes it does. I don't say that it always does, but sometimes it does. But generally, we would ask people to sort of change things up. And there's several different sort of levers that you can change. So one is you can change the foods that you eat, or you can change your sort of fasting style. And that's to us, it's usually the fasting that gets the change. I mean, sometimes it's easier. That's all. And there's different ways you can do that. So if you decide to work on your sort of foods that you eat, you can change. I mean, no matter what you're eating, you can always make changes, right? And generally that is enough to shake it up. And it's not to say that one diet, like there's certain general rules, but there's lots of different diets out there. You can go carnivore, or you can go vegan, or there's different ways. You can go paleo, or you can cut out other things, cut out dairy or something like that. And sometimes these are triggers for people. So the point is that not one diet is always good for everybody. So one person, and this is part of the problem with these sort of people who get into these arguments about diet, is that one person says, well, I'm doing this and it's working so good for me, therefore it must do good for everybody. But that's not true. So a low fat diet does work in a lot of people, and a low carb diet does work in a lot of other people. But you get these people who say, well, I did low fat and I did well, so therefore low fat must be good for everybody. But that's not true. Like, that's good for you. And if it's good for you, go ahead. I don't really care. What I want to do is try and find what's good for somebody else. Or you could switch and do low carb, or you can do high protein, or you can do low fat, or you can do, there's like literally hundreds of different diets out there. So you could change one of those, and maybe it does better for you. Maybe a low fat diet does better for a little bit, and you could change it for a little bit. That's just from a purely pragmatic standpoint. So therefore, you can change the way that you fast, and you can either change it by the way you time it. So instead of going, say you do a 1 meal a day and you go dinner to dinner, well, you can go breakfast to breakfast. I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate switch, and it's still a 24-hour fast. You can change it up. So instead of going 24 hours all the time, you can alternate, say, between 18 and 36 hours. So change that up. So you're still sort of averaging the same amount, but you're doing short and long, just like you would do with exercise. So if you do exercise, well, the biggest thing that everybody found now is super, super effective is high intensity interval training. Well, this is what fasting is. You're trying to change it up so that your body doesn't get used to it. So if you're jogging at a certain pace, like you get better, then boom, you get that plateaus too, where you just flatten out. You're not getting faster, you're not getting slower, but you're not getting a lot better. And I got interested in this because one of the new things that we learned in the 2000s, and it wasn't an issue, nobody ever talked about this in the 90s, was that cancer is an obesity-related disease. And that's become, as we've had this epidemic, it's become more and more clear that this is the case. So the first big acceptance of this wasn't actually till about 2003, when the big studies started to come out showing that obesity is actually a huge risk factor for all kinds of cancers. Now it's well accepted. It's actually about, almost on par with tobacco as a sort of contributor to cancer. So really a large contributor there. And that's how I got interested in this question of how obesity, because I'm dealing with a lot of obesity, that's how I got interested in the question of cancer. It turns out that the cancer question is actually far more interesting and complex than I had thought, which is where this book takes a bit of a different turn. So it's not just about nutrition. So it does talk about nutrition and fasting and cancer, but the first sort of half of the book is really a discussion about what cancer is as a disease. And it's not what we thought it was, because obviously it's not just obesity, right? If you smoke, you get lung cancer, and that has nothing to do with obesity. So why do we get cancer? Like, what is cancer? And that's the real important question that, again, we never ask. So it's just like we talk about obesity, what causes weight gain? We never think about that because we think it's all about calories, right? This is the same question. What is cancer? And this is where we've actually made a lot of changes that people have not probably recognized. So I sort of go through the history of the way we think about cancer, that is not as different diseases, but as a single disease, because the different cancers are quite different. Breast cancer is different than a melanoma, which is different from liver cancer. So they're different, but since about 2000, people have started to look at how cancers behave as a group, and that's led to some real revolutions in the way we think about cancer, which is leading to real revolutions in the way we treat cancer. So I sort of detail there's sort of been three big revolutions in the paradigm, the understanding of cancer. So we started out by thinking of cancer as a disease of excessive growth. So you have a cell, grows too much, right? So you have a lung cancer, which starts as a cell, turns into a cancer, grows too much, and then spreads, right? So it's just a cell that grows too much. And that paradigm of cancer leads you to the logical treatment. If cancer is too much growth, kill it. That's the bottom line. So you develop things like surgery, so you cut it out. You develop things like radiation, where you burn it, or you develop things like chemotherapy, where it's just a poison. It's a selective toxin to the cancer. So cutting, burning, and poisoning. It worked great. Like, honestly, it was a huge sort of leap forward in treatment. Before that, there was no treatment. After that, there was all this treatment. So a lot of cancers got better. It's still the backbone of our therapy today. Cell that grows too much, kill it. But this paradigm started to reach its limits by the 70s, because we had already done the studies, looked for these poisons, looked for different ways to use radiation and all this sort of stuff. But we're reaching the limits of how far that paradigm of understanding. And this is where we were sort of in 2010 sort of thing, where we're making no progress. The paradigm we're using to understand cancer is not useful. And again, you have to go one step deeper in understanding to say, okay, well, we know that there are genes that are being mutated, which cause excessive growth. Okay, we know that, that's true. But what is causing these genes to be mutated? So the big premise of the second paradigm was that it's all random. But there's nothing random about these mutations. Cancer develops, so patient A, patient B, they've developed that cancer independently, right? They had nothing to do with each other. And you can look at, say, patient A, say, living in 1920 in Japan, and patient B with the same cancer, living in 2020 in North America, right? So separated by half a world, by a century apart, those two cancers will look identical. They weren't random. It was not a random change. So what is it that has been causing it? And this is where we are in the midst of a third great revolution in sort of understanding cancer, which is that this is an evolutionary disease and primarily an ecological disease. That is, there's something guiding these mutations, and it's actually a evolutionary process, which is predominantly a response to injury. So when you have a chronic sublethal injury, your body responds in a certain way, and the cell, so if you have chronic injury like tobacco smoke, your lung cells, some will die because of the injury, some will be okay because they didn't get that much injury, but in between there's this chronic sublethal damage. And what that does is, from an evolutionary standpoint, act as a selective pressure for these cells to become more sort of independent and sort of survivalist. They need to survive at all costs because they're dealing with this chronic sublethal injury, and that's what leading them to act more in their own interest than the interest of the entire environment, which is just like, the lung cells have certain rules to be a lung cell. And that lung cell has sort of, under this selective pressure, has evolved differently to become more independent. So it will grow, it becomes immortal, it starts to move around where other cells don't. And that's what the cancer is. It's an evolutionary process. So that's the sort of really interesting part about cancer. And then, once you understand that and you say, okay, well, cancer is actually not a rare disease. It's actually a very common disease. Affects 1 in 10 Americans, that kind of thing. So therefore, if it's such a common disease, then it's not that cancer cells, like the seed of cancer, is always there, because the seed of cancer is the same in all our cells. What is it about the soil? What is it that is allowing these cells to turn into cancer? So again, you have to identify the cause. In that case, it's tobacco smoke. Get rid of the tobacco smoke. In other cases, like breast cancer, that if you move from Japan, for example, to America, your risk of breast cancer actually like triples. So it's not the genetics of it, because the genetics has stayed the same. It's the environment. And one of those things is insulin. Insulin plays a huge role in facilitating the growth of certain types of cancer. So breast cancer is a classic example, where it has 6 times the amount of insulin receptors. And the reason why is that it allows, those insulin receptors allows it to kind of get a lot of glucose. And that's one of the things that you can now exploit and say, well, maybe you can try to reduce the hyperinsulinemia, which is what causes obesity. If you reduce the hyperinsulinemia, you're also going to put these breast cancer cells at a disadvantage compared to a regular breast cell. You're removing some of that fertile soil that allows the seed to grow.